Well, welcome back as we continue to look at the rules that John Owen sets forth in the duties for Christian fellowship. If you remember, what Owen spends the first half of the book in is looking at the duties that congregants owe to their pastors and to their elders. And then the last half of the book is going to deal with the particular duties we have one towards another. So we have worked through the first 5 rules, and Owen only has 2 more in this first section before we come into the second section of the book. So here in this brief video, we'll just discuss Owen's 6th rule, and he states it in this way. He says that the church is to remain loyal to the pastor and stay at his side in all the trials and persecutions that may arise because of the word. So Owen here notes that fidelity, that faithfulness, that committedness to the pastor, particularly when he begins to experience persecutions on account of the word. Now, Owen gives a number of proof texts here, though most of the proof texts that he does give here actually reflect times when people did not stand by their ministers, and particularly with the Apostle Paul. In 2 Timothy 4:16, Paul laments, "At my first defense, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. May it not be charged against them." And then in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 16 through 18, "May the Lord grant mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, for he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. But when he arrived in Rome, he searched for me earnestly and found me. May the Lord grant him to find mercy from the Lord on that day. And you well know all the service he rendered at Ephesus." So Owen uses these 2 counterexamples, if you will, of the way in which people had deserted Paul when he, at least humanly speaking, needed them most, when he was being persecuted and imprisoned and likely facing imminent death. And we know that nobody came to the defense of Paul, that they had all abandoned him. We see that this is not only in the life of Paul, but I suppose Owen could have gone to the life of Jesus as well, that on the night in which he was betrayed, that all of his disciples forsook him when that great crowd came out to arrest him. Even as we read that account in Mark, that one man so terrified by the coming persecution, the thought of Christ's arrest, that he fled unclothed away from the guards. All right, so the principle or the rule that Owen draws out from this is that congregants have a need to remain faithful to their pastors, to remain committed to them, to stay at their side when they endure persecution on account of the word. Now, as Owen goes on, he begins to explain this and unfold this just a little bit. And he has a wonderful quote here on page 28. And I quote from him. He says, "A common cause should be carried out by a common effort." And I think that is true in our day and age, that when we have a common cause, that we are to remain and we are to give a common effort to it. But how easy it is when we're not the leader, that when things get difficult, we abandon ship. And how much more difficult in our day and age than even in John Owen's day, when ministers suffered persecution in his day and age, they could go find another church, but probably not as easy as churches nowadays. Right? And being able to just jump down the street to a new church and kind of dismiss the difficulties and the challenges there. So Owen says here that a common cause needs to be carried out by a common effort. That is to say that pastor and congregants, we're all in this together. That we are all the church of Jesus Christ. That when one member grieves and mourns, the whole body grieves and mourns. When one member suffers, the whole body suffers. So Owen wants to show this organic unity that exists between not just Christ and his people, but also between pastors and Christ's people. So that is what he says here. Now, it's interesting that Owen notes that when persecution does arise, that typically and historically this has always begun with the leaders or with the pastors of the church. And he says this is just in keeping with the biblical principle that if you strike the shepherd, the sheep are going to scatter. And so in times of great persecution, whether it's enemies of the cross of Christ, whether it's governments, whoever it is, all right, when they stick their head up to persecute the church, it is typically aimed against pastors and ministers of the gospel, because they know if they can throw them off, that so too they will be able to scatter the sheep. And so pastors need to be prepared for this. They need to be prepared, as we noted several sessions ago, for the strength of the opposition that comes against them. Again, this is one reason why pastors need your prayers. I remember when I was ordained here in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, that one of the vows that I made as I became a pastor is that I would remain faithfully committed to the Word of God, regardless of what persecutions might arise against me as a result of it. And that's something that not only myself, but also my other elders that I have the joy of serving with are committed to and remain faithful to, is that we will remain faithful and true to the Word of God, regardless of what sufferings come our way. But it's not just us who has to endure this, but the church will and does often need to endure these persecutions as well. And so we see in the day of Paul that when he was persecuted, many deserted him. In Owen's historical situation, this was also happening. When many pastors were being persecuted, they were being imprisoned, they were being oppressed by people, and Owen laments even in his own day how often people would abandon the church that was being persecuted and go and pursue another church where things were more comfortable and things were a little more at ease. Now, this is perhaps a duty that strikes most of us maybe a little odd. And thinking about writing a book like this, would we ever include a section like this? And we probably wouldn't, because the church in the West, or the church in America, has rarely suffered degrees of persecution in the way that the Puritans experienced it, in the way that the early church experienced it, in the way that the Continental Reformers experienced it in their day and age. All right, we are still coming off of this idea within America that to be in a church is to elevate your position in society. And it's not as true anymore today as it was a couple decades ago, but there still remain some amiable relations between church and state and atheists and Christians, that we live in relative peace and harmony. The persecutions aren't so much coming to us from without. Undoubtedly, if history is any teller of things, and if the Bible can be trusted, we ought to expect these fiery trials, as Peter tells us, but in the Lord's kind providences, according to his wisdom, he has spared a lot of us from external persecution. It's a great joy to me to know that when I go to preach on a Sunday morning, that I don't need to fear that police officers or government officials are going to come and break down the door and try and silence me or kick us out of our building so that we have to go and preach out in the fields or something to that nature. We experience and continue to experience a relative degree of peace and harmony with the broader world. And while we don't want to ask, is that good, is that beneficial, why is the Lord doing that? One thing to note, however, is that in my experience and the experience of many other pastors, though we don't have persecution that comes to us from without the church, sometimes our greatest struggles and persecutions come from within the church, and that it is Christians themselves who can so easily begin to draw lines in the sand and begin to demand of people, either you're going to be allegiant to the officers and the authorities, the pastor of the church, or you need to come and side with me. In this day and age where people often give vent to their frustrations and they like to go and gossip and slander, right? Oftentimes it can become a us versus them mentality of the church rising up against the pastor, or at times even the whole session in general. And when there are internal strifes and feudings within the church, this is always lamentable. This is always regrettable. It's always the result of somebody's sin somewhere that brings this on. And particularly those people who aren't necessarily involved in it can get very tired and almost frustrated with the situation. and rather than enduring and rather than bearing with, can just as easily abandon the conflicted church and try to go for a church that isn't as tension-filled, right? And one wonders if John Owen were here today and he looked out at Christianity and at the many churches that have difficulties within the church itself, how he might counsel us in light of this duty that he has thrown down. And I think it's fair to say that what Owen would teach us, or at least the practical implications that arise from this, right, is that individuals within the church largely have a duty and an obligation to remain faithful to a faithful pastor and a faithful session, or elders, those who shepherd the people of God. Right, that people need to not be so quickly drawn away in heart and mind and thought and affections for their shepherds and for their ministers, but that in all things, right, and particularly in things pertaining to the ministry, they ought to have our respect and our trust. I think we get at least a working principle here from the Apostle Paul. Right, that as he talks of church discipline and specifically bringing charges against an elder, Paul lays down in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 19, that one cannot even entertain an accusation of sin against an elder without 2 or more witnesses. In a very practical way, the reason Paul lays that down is because, especially as pastors, are really up front and center. They're really the face of the church. They have the largest public ministry amongst the elders. And it often happens that pastors also become the whipping child, or they're scorned by other people. That we often say things, we even do things that people don't like, whether that's outright sin, as we talked in an earlier session, or whether that's just the preferences of individuals. And so the more public an individual is, the more likely they become the subjects and even at times the victims of gossip and slander. And it's easy to be carried away by these thoughts, all right? To hear perhaps Jane Doe say, well, you wouldn't believe what the pastor told me, or blah, blah, blah. You should have seen the way he sneered at me. Right? Now, this could be very unintentional on the part of the pastor. But Jane Doe, getting bent out of shape, goes and spreads these the slander, this gossip around, or begins to spread gossip about whether or not the session can be trusted, and starts to sow seeds of dissension within the church. Right? Well, Paul lays down this principle that you can't entertain an accusation of sin without 2 or more witnesses. This is going to protect the reputation and the good name of ministers and of the session. It's going to keep them from feeling like they have to justify all of their actions before everybody at all times. So Paul gives us this command that we can't entertain an accusation of sin. And as that's applied to this duty that Owen tells us, right? Owen says that when ministers begin to endure persecution, that it is imperative for the congregation to remain faithful and loyal to the pastor. And I think that's telling, and it gets to the heart as well of what Paul is encouraging us with. Right? That we ought to hope and expect and trust and believe all good things about those men who have been duly gifted and equipped and called and elected and installed into this office of minister, or we could broaden that out to the office of elder as well. So I think that is what we need to take away, or at least one takeaway from this, that though we don't experience a lot of external persecution, ministers can often experience a great deal of internal suffering and persecution. And it's becoming of a congregation to remain faithful and loyal to their pastor, to pray for him in those times, to encourage him in those times, to stand beside him in those times. Right? As Owen had so wisely said earlier, as we've already quoted, a common cause should be carried out by a common effort. So this is the 6th rule that Owen lays down. But I think it's also pertinent to address at least one practical issue that arises from this. As Owen states this rule, he gives us a very important qualification, right? And he notes here that the church is to remain loyal to the pastor and to stay at his side in all the trials and persecutions that may arise because of the word. If you've been in churches long enough, if you've known ministers long enough, you know that some of the persecution and suffering that they endure, well, how do we say it? We could say that it is justifiable. All right, that some people, some men deserve to endure hardships. Doesn't mean they should endure gossip and slander. It's never acceptable or okay. All right, but that sometimes ministers, just as everybody, we bring our own trials and sufferings upon ourselves. And when a minister is suffering due to some fact of his own sin, I don't think that the congregation has the obligation to necessarily stand by their pastor. All right, now this has regrettably been played out in many scenarios in our contemporary church. A number of years ago, news broke that a very large pseudo-reform denomination, it was discovered that they were covering up sexual abuse scandals within the church. All right, a number of years ago, there was a well-known pastor who was prominent in a leading evangelical, and he had abusive leadership styles, and yet people were kind of silenced and thinking, well, he's the pastor, right? And when people came and they called to account these churches for their sexual abuse cover-ups or this abusive leadership, right? You think of this, it's been played out many, many times, that often churches and leaders can feign a sense of devotion and committedness to their pastor, right? And say, well, we're trying to keep his reputation, or, this would wreck the church if this were brought to light, right? We wanted to stand by, we wanted to remain committed to our pastor as he's been committed to us. Yet in all of these cases, I think that would be a wrong way to remain committed and stand fast to your pastor. That Owen doesn't encourage here. The Bible never encourages standing by, in a sense, that you sweep real grievous sins under the rug. Where you say, well, we're not going to let this out because this would really destroy his reputation, the reputation of the church. Sometimes his reputation needs to get destroyed. All right. Sometimes a minister does need to be forced out of the ministry due to grievous sins. And so the qualification that Owen notes here is that when a minister suffers because of the word, when he suffers for being a faithful shepherd, when he suffers for proclaiming the truth of God's word, when he suffers because he is walking in a manner that is worthy of the calling to which he has been called, Owen is encouraging congregants to deal patiently and loyally, not with one who is suffering because of his unrighteousness, but one who is suffering because of his righteousness. And this is exactly what the Apostle Peter speaks about in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 20, and then later on again in chapter 3, verses 8 through 22. Is what good is it if you suffer for wrongdoing? Right? Basically, Peter is saying you deserve that. But when you suffer for righteousness' sake, that's when these sufferings abound to the glory of God. So we want to see congregants loyal and faithful and committed to the cause and to the effort of the gospel and of the church of Jesus Christ. So the sixth and second to last rule that Owen lays down is that the church is to remain loyal to the pastor and to stay at his side in all the trials and persecutions that may arise because of the word. I hope you enjoyed this sixth lesson and the sixth duty from John Owen. Please tune in again for the seventh and final rule as it pertains to congregants' duties to their pastors. Hope you have a wonderful day.